I've done is really just try to hone in on what are some of the observations I can make about what has worked so far and where are the roadblocks in terms of progressing gender equality in the workforce, particularly within these female-concentrated industries, and to offer some reflections and observations on, where are the opportunities, where are the potential avenues to really make a difference in the bigger federal policy landscape. So with that in mind, as an economist, I'm going to share some numbers and some statistics here for you, just to sort of be clear about what do we mean by feminized industries. And I'm going to use the word female concentrated, because really that's what it comes down to. It's based on a percentage. And I think the overall mission is to let go of the notion that we have industries that are female or male, ideally, but that's not to say that there is a lot of social context which is loaded into our existing understandings of those industries. But basically what you can see here is ABS data where we have the employment numbers of women and men, so blue for men and red for women. And from left to right on your screen, they're ordered in terms of concentration of women. So the highest female concentration industries are on the left side here. If you were to add up healthcare and social assistance, education and training, and retail trade, you would end up with almost half of your total female workforce. That's how starkly gender concentrated and gender segregated the Australian workforce is. So these green dots correspond to the gender share, which is the right-hand side. So we're talking within the vicinity of around 70 up to 80% of those workforces being female. We've got quite a number of industries that are more gender balanced. I think it's important not to overlook these in the bigger picture. The gender pay gap actually exists in all of these industries, so even in the female-dominated industries. So what we see, I guess, amplified in these female-concentrated industries is still an issue in so many of these other industries as well. Down the end here on the right-hand side, we've got the industries which are the flip side of the equation, so proportionally more male-dominated. If you were to add up construction, manufacturing, and transport, postal, and warehousing, those three industries alone provide 1/3 of all jobs for men in Australia. So they're the nature of the industries that have very few females in them. And I'm conscious of the fact too that, even though we're talking about feminized industries or female concentrated industries, a lot of policies are also focused on how do we break down the notion of these industries being so heavily gender concentrated in the other direction. And this is not news to, I guess, most people tuning in here today, is that there is this general correlation between the share of an industry that is female and wages. So from left to right on the screen here, you can see the higher earning industries, and the green dot is an indication of the degree of female representation within that industry. So you can see these are the more female-dominated industries up here, and that is sitting on the right-hand side of this equation. So this is really, using these statistics to paint a picture to communicate the essence of the problem. Look, when we talk about that gender wage gap, a lot of the data to begin with looks at average wages, and when we unpack it a bit further, this really is about a pay gradient in many cases. So this report by the Grattan Institute, Julie Sonneman, who specialises in the education sector, gives you an indication of what we mean by a flat or a sort of a flat trajectory in terms of how a worker's pay progresses or doesn't progress for their years within the industry. So comparable entry levels with teaching compared to some an assortment of different other disciplines here, but you can just see how there is no reward or return for longevity, for experience within the teaching profession as compared to some of these other industries. And a similar sort of picture can be painted within healthcare and social assistance, such as nursing occupations. Now, I know if you were to speak to people within those industries, I know that there is a certain approach towards valuing every teacher. Every teacher is a teacher. You know, should we really be making a distinction between different teachers according to pay? So that is sort of a part of, you know, the culture or the thinking potentially, which is sort of impeding that. But nonetheless, this is the nature of the type of issues that contribute to the overall industry being low paid. So just a few notes, I guess, to sort of summarise. We're talking about this flat pay gradient. As I mentioned before, this discussion shouldn't exclude or overlook the fact that these pay inequities sit across all industries. Of the 19 industry categories that we have in the Australian workforce, the gender pay gap is present in all of them, and that's measuring full-time ordinary hour earnings. And it's even more profound when you take into account overtime and bonuses. And so in the bigger scheme of things, some of the issues that this really lends itself to is how do we design policies and interventions that will address some of the reasons for these inequities and differentials in pay, such as women's disproportionate share of workforce interruptions that are associated with the time that they spend on unpaid care, and also this power of implicit and systemic biases and gender norms, which really are pervasive in so many dynamics within the workforce. I think historically, and I'd be keen to hear the discussion from within the group, and for some of you will have even more experience and insight into this than I do in terms of IR history. Really what has been relied on at a national level at least, and this is by way of the Industrial Relations Tribunal system, is the equal pay case, test cases, to put forward a case where a female concentrated occupation can put forward a claim that they should be paid more because they've identified what they call a male comparator. That is a male dominated occupation where it can be demonstrated that they're delivering jobs that are worth the same value, but this male occupation is being paid more. It has a very low success rate in terms of using this channel. And one of the most recent outcomes, if some of you have been following this was a decision that came out just a few months ago, which gives you an indication of the types of things that the Industrial Relations Tribunal is looking for. So this was a case put forward for early childhood teachers' wages to be increased, and they were attempting to compare that to male teachers in primary schools and to male professional engineers. And I don't mean for you to read all of this, but this is the nature of the type of outcomes or decisions that were arrived at the end of the case. And you can get a sense that they were actually quite dismissive, and they came to a conclusion that trying to compare early childhood educators to engineers is an inappropriate comparison, because by their understanding or their assessment, the engineers were far more specialised and more diverse. And it's almost as if, to my interpretation of this, is that it was quite dismissive of what's required in early childhood teaching. I would like to see a bunch of engineers go and run a childhood early learning centre for a day. But this is an example of the type of hurdle that is being required if this is the mechanism by which we're relying on those female-dominated industries to earn and to be for a wage for a recognition of their value. This is the mechanism that's being relied upon, and this is the nature of the types of responses that they're getting. So I think it is almost, and consulting with the unions, I think would be very informative for that issue, but it is almost a case of really looking towards other avenues, because that is really almost like a roadblock based on the track record of success. So what I'd like to share with you now are just a few points for further discussion about where there is potential. I'd highlight the fact that the Senate did conduct a inquiry into gender segregation. It was chaired by Jenny McAllister, put forward a set of, I thought, were really well-informed policy recommendations, the core of which was the need to develop a national policy framework surrounding pay equity, with implications for the Fair Work Commission. Some really interesting outcomes out of that was also to focus on going through like a pipeline and to realise that so many of these outcomes that we observe start very early on, with when students are deciding on their education, and which leads to their career pathways. So there were even included in that suite of recommendations, policies to focus on the information and the guidance that's given to students early on. But I think I've added this note here that I feel like what the research really points towards is that it's no use coming up with any type of framework or policies unless you embed, and even to the extent of legislating, who has responsibility for these outcomes and defining those outcomes, those targets. At state level, I know in Victoria with the Gender Equality Act now, you do have a list of targeted indicators that workplaces need to measure. So it's almost a case of putting that forward to governments now as well. So embedding, identifying like a dashboard of indicators and building accountability, I think has to be part of any type of policy proposal. One other, or the next one here I've got listed is a policy direction, which is gaining more traction at the moment. And it's mandated transparency and pay gap reporting. And this came into place in Denmark, and a study of it, it was a very well conducted study because the mandate applied to workplaces of a certain size. And so they looked at those workplaces and compared them to those other workplaces who had just not quite enough employees to be required to undertake the mandated reporting. So they had sort of like a fair comparison. And it's a really interesting finding because they did in fact discover that the overall pay gap did narrow. But what the mechanism was that contributed to that was not that women's wages were catching up. It's because men's wage growth was slowing down, and that's what was giving rise to the convergence. But what was also interesting about that is that those firms, those organisations that were required to now be transparent in their pay gap reporting also experienced a greater attraction to female workers. So there was some self-selecting going on amongst females to actually gravitate towards those industries or to those organisations. The UK is now pushing forward with this, and WGEA, in its own analysis of private firms, they have identified that is a mechanism that does give rise to a larger narrowing of the pay gap within private organisations. So I think keep an eye on that, and I think that's something where you can already start to initiate governments to really pay attention to the evidence that's coming through. This is probably going a bit beyond just focusing on particular industries, but really the research that's coming through is the need really to set in place policies that incentivize and compel a shift in gender norms. And I use that word quite deliberately because it's more than just promote and encourage. We're talking about almost something just short of enforcing people to change behaviour. And a good example here is paid parental leave and attaching a use it or lose it mechanism to it. So it's not that, oh, fathers have the option to take paid parental leave. It's if you don't use your allocation of paid parental leave, you can't transfer it. So it's non-transferable. In Quebec, in Canada, they brought that in, and it did correspond with an improvement in women's full-time labour force participation. And so there is evidence there and it did contribute to a more even sharing of household chores as well. And I think a lot of the focus is on parental, as in childcare, and it would be important, I think, for the policy discourse to also talk in terms of carers, keeping in mind that disproportionately it's more women who allocate time towards looking after family members with disability and elderly members of the family. So that will expand and broaden the scope in an appropriate way. Personally, I'm quite struck by the research that really points towards the needs to not just focus on, what women have to do differently, but men and this male breadwinner norm. And it comes really from sociology, but it's intersecting with economics in a very powerful way. And if you haven't read it yet, this paper by Rob Brunig and Jean from an ANU economist, and it shows you that within Australian households, when women start to earn more than their partner, so more than 50% of total household income, their incidence of emotional abuse and domestic violence actually increases. And what it's pointing towards is that on one hand, we're trying to empower and encourage women to step into non-traditional roles, to earn more, to be financially independent. But there is a risk there that it's actually destabilising the identity and the norms and the roles that men have been socially conditioned to align themselves with, without really replacing it with something for men to aspire to beyond just the male breadwinner norm, to be incentivized to also want to aspire to care for their children or contribute to the community. So I think that is in the background of a lot of this, and I would be suggesting that policies that point towards or try to encourage women to step into leadership, into STEM, into non-traditional roles do have to be matched with an understanding of how that could be seen as a threat to men's role and men's identity, unless you're also really supporting and really setting up the infrastructure for men to also expand their roles as well. Just quickly, I'm conscious of time. I think expanding more on acknowledging and quantifying the societal value of human services and care is extremely important, which goes without saying. And we've got this great case study now with COVID, but it's been grossly undervalued, and it really doesn't come into play when you look at the wages that accrue to those workers. And the final big picture one is one of gender responsive budgeting and gender lensing. You've probably heard a lot of talk about it. And I remember Andrew Leigh at the last federal election saying that Labor had made a promise that every new policy would go through a gender impact assessment. And in Victoria, they've now got the gender responsive budgeting unit. So they're going ahead with it in Victoria. And really so many of the levers happen at federal government level as well. Effective marginal tax rates is a classic example here. But really, I think that would be the game changer, because it puts up the radar to be alert to gender differentials in all policy decision making. So you're not even you're going beyond just looking at feminized industries, you're casting that lens more broadly. And I think really that would be such a powerful legacy for any government to leave behind. I've just also got a reminder there, a lot of the policies that the federal government has come out with their women's economic statements, I guess, are well-meaning, but they're really putting the onus on women to do things differently, opt into a different career, step up into leadership without thinking, well, what is it about the environment and the infrastructure that's deterring women from doing that in the first place? So less focus on women, or going beyond that to actually focus on fixing the system. That would be my go-to. How are we going for time? Because I don't want to go over time.
Okay. About 5 more minutes.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks.
We're a little over, that's fine. Yeah.
Great. Okay. I don't want to encroach on the other speakers. So, look, in terms of obstacles, I think, look, the reality is, yes, there will be absolutely resistance and backlash to this. And, in economics, we haven't done enough to acknowledge that and to research that. I've drawn some insights from some other disciplines, and this the first 2 bullet points here are some of the insights that came from a study of Australian workers, and they were asked about what is your level of support for diversity initiatives within the workplace. And they also then asked them about, well, what are the values that really matter for you as an individual? And they found this correlation. The people who were least supportive of diversity and equality initiatives on the basis of gender, on the basis of disability, on the basis of race, were the people who put the strongest value on these first 2 things. They put a high value on conservatism, so preservation of tradition and status quo, and a high value on opportunities for self-enhancement and achievement. So this makes sense, right? But this helps us to understand how these are actually the things that we're up against when we're met with resistance to equality initiatives. And I'd also point you, like my way of sort of interpreting a lot of the pushback we get, statements like, well, we want men to succeed, but not at the expense of women, is really a diversion tactic. And there is a paper out there that talks about the paradox of meritocracy. So people and organisations that go out of their way to emphasise meritocracy are actually the ones that are more likely not to have a meritocratic system. It's like they're going out of their way to try to convince themselves that they do have it. So we see that in our federal leader at the moment. And sort of a doubling down on values that really no one is disputing. We all want meritocracy, but we just don't have a system in place that gives rise to that. So I think being able to call it out is actually really important as well. I've also got a note there about be careful of policies disguised as support, but actually reinforce gender norms. And the one I'm really thinking of most recently is the support that came through in the latest federal budget, which was to provide the childcare rebate if you'd had 2 or more children. And so we know that the effective marginal tax rate and childcare costs and a tapering of family tax benefit B works against women as the second income earner in most families to increase their work hours from part-time to full-time. And the really interesting, condition that really was attached to that was, well, you have to have 2 or more children. So there was something in there which I actually interpret as being a pro-natalist element, because it was just as much of an impediment for people who only had one child, right? So it was I think that ideology of the family and women as child bearers rather than labour force participants was actually still there in that policy. Just for the interest of time, I'll just skip over this last bit here. The example I've also found myself up against or being challenged by is when we propose gender responsive budgeting, and I've been doing a bit of work for some other state governments too. And some of the pushback that we encounter when you propose it is, for a start, we don't want to set up another piece of bureaucracy. So they see it as just another layer of, resourcing and staff and, slowing down the process, rather than as an actual efficiency gain, which it is, you're delivering better policy. But also they see it as potentially competing with funding for high-vis physical infrastructure, utilities, etc., because often gender-responsive budgeting does highlight how so much funding does go towards that and not much to social housing or human services. And so one mechanism to use, if you were so inclined from economics, is to consider how actually if you invest properly in your capital, then you're improving your capital to labour ratio. And that's your formula for higher worker productivity, right? So you're actually generating a scenario where your workers are improving their productivity, which is a lever for wage growth, assuming you have a proper wage mechanism in place that responds to that. And that would apply to your female concentrated industries. So actually it's not competing with, it's complementary to gender equality outcomes, but we have to do a really good job of communicating it so that it's not dismissed at the first instance because it's seen as in a very simplified paradigm. Okay, I've got a few notes there about gender responsive budgeting that I'm going to leave with you to take away for the you can take these slides, and if anyone's interested, there are some resources to read more about, because I really think that inevitably a government in Australia is going to come back to this, and it's just about when and where and or who and when, and if we can contribute to that process. So thank you.